Welcome to EER's webinar. We're going to look at the far-right challenge in Europe, North America, and Israel. Over the last half-decade or so, the consciousness of the far-right question has become a lot higher in Western countries. This is focused particularly on neo-Nazism and other forms of violent extremism. But we're gathered to look at the broader threat matrix, which includes the non-violent elements of it and other authoritarian tendencies in the political systems across the West. They've made significant advances, mostly democratically, which has been quite worrying because this has led to diminution of liberal and other legal practices by majoritarian governments. And these domestic changes have counterparts in foreign policy, namely a reorientation of these states away from liberal international institutions like NATO and towards other countries like Russia. This dynamic is now beginning to be seen somewhat in Israel, where the recent election brought to power figures from the extreme right who will sit in the next cabinet. And where that goes, we don't really know yet, but maybe our panelists will. So we have an expert panel with us today. We have Colin Clarke, who's a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center and the director of policy and research at the Soufan Group. We have Tommaso Virgili, who is a postdoctoral fellow at WZB, the Berlin School, Social Science Center, the Berlin Social Science Center. Richard Peter, who is the director of the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Center, or BICOM. And Yonatan, Levi, who is a PhD candidate at the European Institute. Welcome to you all, and if I go to Colin for the first round.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks to EER for the invitation to speak today. Quite a deal of what I'll cover in my brief overview is based off of a paper that I wrote for the Resolve Network with one of my colleagues, Jason Blazakis, last year, and it was called From Paramilitaries to Parliamentarians, and we kind of sketched out what we saw as the spectrum of far-right extremism. Or what we called in the paper radical right-wing extremism. The terminology itself is even a matter of great debate, particularly in the United States, where it's taken on a heavily political connotation. And I was, witness on Capitol Hill to some of the very vehement disagreements over what this phenomenon, if you want to call it, should be characterized as. But Kyle's right, the world has seen a dramatic increase in the visibility and activity of what we here in the US call racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, or REMVs, including radical right-wing extremist movements over the past decade. After nearly 2 decades of Western countries focusing almost exclusively on the threat posed by Salafi jihadist groups, the challenge posed by a growing radical right-wing extremist movement is now impossible to ignore. High-profile attacks in North America, Europe, and even in Asia Pacific have forced policymakers and security agencies to address the insidious nature of the various ideologies underpinning radical right-wing extremism. There's a belated but growing recognition of the dangers presented by the far right and outward expressions and increasing resonance with far-right views and behaviors in the past decade around the world. Now, after an attack occurs involving a far-right perpetrator, extremists in online and virtual spaces celebrate the event and distribute propaganda meant to promote this ideology. The global far-right is extremely broad in nature and far from monolithic. While the far-right is often used as an umbrella term, using the term runs the risk of oversimplifying the differences and linkages between white supremacist, anti-immigration, nativist, and other motivating ideologies. These beliefs and political platforms fall within the far-right rubric, and too often the phrase presents a more unified image of the phenomena than is actually the case. In truth, the far-right and the individual movements that comprise it are fragmented, consisting of a number of groups that lack established leadership and cohesion. Indeed, these movements often include chauvinist religious organizations, neo-fascist street gangs, and paramilitary organs of established political parties. Although such movements largely lack the mass appeal of the interwar European radical right-wing extreme, they nevertheless can inspire both premeditated and spontaneous acts of violence against perceived enemies. Support for far-right extremism in general is often couched in the language of domestic politics. This remains true even as the objectives are more ideological in nature and less about actual policy reform per se. In many European countries where the fragmentation of the far right has accelerated, far-right groups lack established leadership and are the subject of more aggressive efforts to combat them, I think including the UK. One result of fragmentation has been the proliferation of numerous smaller groups, parties, and organizations. While concerns of a neo-fascist takeover of Europe are exaggerated, it's still important to identify and track the development of diffuse organizations across several different echelons. And I'll just briefly walk through the way we conceive these four typologies of radical right-wing extremist movements. The first is parliamentary movements or parties primarily focused on electoral success, representing a radical right-wing extremist fringe breaking into the political landscape. Next, we talked about protest movements, which are, in our conception, often connected to more radical political elements, but at least publicly remain concentrated around single issues, quite often nativist rage, rather than any larger plan for reorganizing society. You then got street movements, which are a close relative to protest movements, but often take a more macro approach to grievances. Street movements are generally less concerned with securing electoral power and instead represent a more concerted effort at mass mobilization and a revival of traditional fascist or ultranationalist movements. And lastly, you've got underground movements, which are largely organized online or through affiliated subcultures. And although far less popular and visible than other more public radical right-wing extremist organizations, these groups often are rhetorically more extreme and more prone to violence, both spontaneous and premeditated. And then I'll just close by saying the surge of far-right extremism is also dependent, as we know and as we've learned, on geopolitics and world events. Civil war in the Middle East can impact the popularity of far-right political parties in Europe, particularly those that favor a hard line against migrants. This opens the door to xenophobic rhetoric, the use of language describing migrants as invaders, which is the same language used in the manifesto of far-right attackers, as we've seen in Norway, New Zealand, El Paso, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Tommaso, if we go over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Let me first say that I really appreciate the way European Eye on Radicalization framed this webinar, because it's always good to distinguish between violent extremism and non-violent extremism. One can lead to the other, but this is not necessarily the case. In fact, what we see in Europe is that when it comes to terrorism, Europol reports in the last years show that the biggest threat to Europe is by far jihadism, and to a certain extent, even more than far right, the far left extremism. For example, in 2021, there were 4 attacks in the European Union. 3 of those were jihadists, one was from the far left, and 2/3 of those arrested for terrorism were jihadi terrorists. So this, of course, does not underplay the political threat of the far right. And with this, I would like to define the term extremism, and I will do so by endorsing the definition of the German Federal Ministry of Interior that defines extremism as the ideology that threatens the constitutional order and aims to replace the liberal democratic society with a totalitarian one based on its own ideology. So I think this definition is important to avoid, as Colin was also saying, that sort of reductio ad Hitlerum, whereby any idea which is outside the mainstream becomes extremist by its own nature. So, for example, if I have to put things in practical terms, Brexit, as much as I would have liked not to happen, was certainly not an extremist project, as has been depicted. It was a legitimate, albeit despicable decision by British people and the British government and parliament. And this is radically different from the assault on Capitol Hill, which was instead a direct threat and a violent one against the liberal democratic order. Now, another definition that we need to look at is that of far right. The Anti-Defamation League defines far right in more nuanced terms, And especially they include within far right also elements of mainstream conservatism, as long as these are in the fringe of the political spectrum. So it's a kind of a more nuanced definition. So having set the scene, I think it's also important to distinguish between the traditional extreme right and the new right. When it comes to the traditional far right, which has its roots deeply in neo-Nazism, neo-fascism, we can actually see that it shares many tenets with jihadism or with the extreme left. We are in front of movements that are strongly anti-individualist, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, on the international scene, anti-American, anti-NATO, anti-Israel, usually pro-Russia. If you look, for example, at Mélenchon in France, it's difficult on all these topics to distinguish any difference between him and Marine Le Pen. So this is, let's say, the traditional right. The new right, I think, is a bit different. And first of all, is more differentiated when it comes to the origin. If we look at the far-right political spectrum in Europe, we will see that there are certain parties that have their roots actually in neo-fascism and that have moderated their stances. This is the case for Fratelli d'Italia, for instance, for the Freedom Party in Austria, for the Swedish Democrats. And on the other side, you have those parties that have instead roots in the center right, or in certain cases even center left, and that have kind of shifted their focus towards the right. This is the case for the AfD in Germany, for Fidesz in Hungary. Orban was actually a leftist liberal in his origin. For the Northern League in Italy, which has even been allied with the left at some point, and also for the Freedom Party of the Netherlands, to mention a few. Now, this new right has changed quite sensibly from the traditional far right. First of all, because it presents itself as the champion of liberalism and the champion of the West against the threat coming from abroad, from exogenous elements. And the differences are also evident when it comes to the foreign policy stances. Not always, but this right tends to be pro-Israel, for instance. It tends to be pro-America, and it has mixed positions when it comes to Russia. It used to be very pro-Russia, and now you can see some shifts after the invasion of Ukraine. For example, while the Rassemblement National is still strongly pro-Russia, like AfD in Germany, in Italy you will see that Fratelli d'Italia, which is the far-right party that has expressed the prime minister, is the strongest ally of Ukraine, along with the liberal center, much more than the center-right of Berlusconi, much more than the center-left of the Democratic Party, which at the European Parliament has seen 3 of its members to vote against the resolution that declares Russia a sponsor of terrorism, and certainly much more than the populist Five-Star movement that has governed both with Lega Nord and with the Democratic Party. Now, what are the elements which, in my view, contradistinguish the new right is the focus on identity. So identity, real or perceived, comes to the fore as the dominant pole of attraction for the new right. Now, as political scientist Ivan Krastev, among others, has said, we live in a time of identity politics that conditions both the left and the right. And in a way, in a vicious circle where each identity politics, for minorities when it comes to the left and for the majority when it comes to the right, nurtures each other. If you have a left that stresses the identity of minorities and also the claims of minorities against the majority, then you have a reaction on the side of the majority that tends to defend its perceived identity, And likewise, when the majority stresses its own identity against the minorities, you will have a reactive protection from minorities. And this does not necessarily have like a real effect on policies, politics, and legislation. Because in this identity game, symbolism is very important. Let's look, for example, at the role of religion. Now, these parties are not traditionally religious parties. We are not before the Italian Democrazia Cristiana or the German CDU. Actually, these parties are, in many cases, despised by the respective churches and do not even attempt to follow any teaching of the church except for certain flagship symbolic battles, the one against LGBT, the one against abortion, that in many cases do not even produce any practical effect on the legislation. And by the way, they don't produce effect because these parties have no interest in actually pursuing a real religious politics, because all data shows that European societies are secularizing very fast, not only in the traditional Central Europe and Northern Europe, but even in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So religion becomes a symbolism. You might have seen Salvini from Lega Nord surrounded by Madonna, saints, rosaries, all the while presenting himself as the typical macho that likes women and good food. Orban, that, as I said, comes from the liberal left and that has embraced Christianity in a nativist way as a proxy for its battle against migration. In Russia, we have a slightly different case because Putin has actually made an iron bond with the Orthodox Church, but still we can see that the dynamics there point to that direction. Now, I'm sure we will hear more about Israel, where I think there are some similarities in the use of religion, but also some differences, because Israel has certainly a stronger religious identity and even a stronger constitutional religious framework when it comes to state legislation and the functioning of the state itself. Now, this identity element, I think, drives very much also the main point of success of the new right, which is this battle against migration. Migration, as Colin was said, is perceived as a threat, sometimes with nativist tones, like the threat against the purity of the nation. But I would argue that this is not the main. It's not the main threat that comes from the right in this moment, in the sense that I find here some faults on the left as well. I mean, there are certain grievances that come from societies that hold their roots in real problems of society. Migration, that is now being discussed at the European Union for a reform, is a domain where we can see the current rules are not really working. Integration, we have seen what happened these days, where migrants and Moroccan youth in the Netherlands and Belgium have looted cities after a soccer match. We know what happened with Pakistani gangs in England. We know what happened in France with Muslim extremists. And we can also see that many surveys and quantitative researches show that even second and third generation migrants struggle to keep on par with the liberal values of the host society. These are real problems that the left has wrongfully left to the right, and the right has made them its gold mine, because people perceive that there are problems there, and actually as only right now the right or the far right to bring forward the instances that these problems provoke. Where I think instead that the right poses a real threat in Europe now is on the rule of law. Here as well, I'm very keen to hear more about Israel, because I think that we are seeing similar dynamics there with religious Zionism. But when it comes to Hungary and Poland, the European Union has engaged a battle with them when it comes to the rule of law. And it doesn't do so because it's a despotic agent of Soros that tries to impose LGBT globalizing agenda. No, it does so because it's defending the rules of the club, which is a club based on the rule of law. Now, I don't want to be long, but Poland and Hungary have both dismantled or tried to dismantle the rule of law in key domains. They have appointed judges in an illegitimate way. They have dismissed other judges in an illegitimate way. They have refused to comply with constitutional court judgments or to publish them. They have refused to recognize the supremacy of the EU law. They have attempted to shut down, or they have done it, media, NGOs, universities that are against the government. And when they have not succeeded, is mostly because the European Court of Justice, the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the European Court of Human Rights have prevented these attempts. Now, I don't want to claim that the judicial power is necessarily good in itself, as some say, but it's good in the sense that it represents a balance against the other powers, as much as the other powers represent a balance with each other. So the system of checks and balances cannot be destroyed, otherwise we destroy the rule of law and individual freedoms. And this is certainly not something that we can accept in the European Union or elsewhere. Now, is this a threat that comes only from the right? I wouldn't say so, because during the pandemic, as many NGOs from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Freedom House have acknowledged, pretty much all governments of the world have taken advantage of the pandemic to advance measures that were clearly unconstitutional. Just to make the example of Italy, the president, the prime minister, with decrees that had not even legal value, managed to close citizens, to confine citizens in their houses in a way that judges and lawyers have said was stricter than house arrests. So it's not a threat that comes necessarily from only from the far right, but it's true that now in the European Union, especially Hungary and Poland, represent a bad example. I think, to conclude, that the rule of law is as precious as fragile, and we need to be wary of any violation of the rule of law. We need to protect our liberal constitutional order without, at the same time, polarizing or exasperating divisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we can go over to Richard.
Sure. Carl, thank you very much indeed for having me this afternoon. I know that we've published you before in our magazine, so it's great to be hosted by you. It's appreciated and nice to join all of you. I will address and focus my remarks relative to the situation in Israel. I'm coming to you here from Jerusalem. Despite my accent, I've been in Jerusalem for the last 24 years, and serve kind of primarily as a political analyst here. So I'll focus on the results and kind of what's happening next here as far as we can best assess. I want to start though with a quick story. Relates to a British diplomat, I think in 1949 or 1950, very shortly after the State of Israel was created. He sent back a cable back to the British Foreign Ministry, giving his political assessment on the new founded State of Israel, of which he believed was on the cusp of turning into a dictatorship. And his evidence based on that were actually kind of all individually quite compelling and reasonable. He looked at the political system, saw that there was one dominant political party. It was led by a very charismatic authoritarian style leader. The country itself had just fought a war, was beset, surrounded by enemies. In fact, even the Arab population domestically were living under military rule at the time. There was a large percentage of the population of immigrants, primarily the Jews from the Arab world, coming with no democratic democratic tradition, and politically the country was orientating itself quite close to the Soviet Union at the time, and as well with kind of a socialist orientation ethos, both around organized labor and communal living. Of course, that picture kind of paints an assessment that it was heading towards the dictatorship. I think we can say confidently over the last 70 years that was proven very, very wrong. And I think Israel has a very impressive and credible record when it comes to a variety of liberal policy, certainly in terms of women's rights and LGBT community, let's say until now. Excuse me. So I think my first message for that is kind of in terms of, as we're talking December the 1st, we're waiting for the government formation here, is just to wait and see until be a little bit judicious. In terms of commenting on the election results and what happened, I think it's worth looking a little bit closer at the numbers and understanding that in terms of the popular vote here, the country is still split, almost 50-50 between the pro and anti-Netanyahu camps. But what happened as a result of the elections was basically that the right played much better politics. Organizationally, they organized themselves into 4 distinct parties with no wasted votes, unlike on the left, which saw the proliferation, excuse me, which saw a proliferation of the parties both within the Israeli Arab sector, but also on the Israeli left. And there were no wasted votes on the right at all. Again, if we look at the results, we see that 2 parties on the anti-Netanyahu camp, both Balad, the hardline pro-Palestinian party, and Meretz, the human rights left-wing Israeli party, both of them very close, 3% of the votes, but failed to get over the crucial threshold, which led to 300,000 votes, effectively about 6 seats being wasted. And that was really where the difference was made in terms of the success of the right. So I think that's important to bear in mind, that the country did not surge to the right, but in fact is still very deeply divided. But the better politics on the right kind of won the day. In terms of the extreme right itself, again, put it in proportion that the Religious Zionist Party won 11% of the vote, which means that that 89-90% almost of the population were not voting for the hard right. We've now seen, even amongst us these days, and the negotiations to form a coalition, they split into their constituent parts. So even Ben-Gvir himself is down to now 6-seat representation in the parliament. And we have to look that when he ran independently in March 2020, he won 0.4% of the vote. When he ran last time in March 21, already running together with the Religious Zionists, they were successful and he was able to enter parliament. But what really changed in that time period were the events of May 2021, when there was rioting in the mixed cities across the Israeli Arab sector, and Ben-Gvir was able to very successfully tap into the populism. I don't think people were voting him because he is racist, which he is, and anti-Arab and anti-gay homosexuals, but they were voting because he was speaking on an agenda that resonated with some of the Israeli public, and that's of security and kind of the fear, either fear or anger against the wave of terrorism. And sadly, that wave of terrorism has continued throughout this year. We had an example of it again last week, and sadly, that's living with us here in Israel. But I will say that kind of the election of Ben-Gvir and his imminent appointment to the cabinet is definitely a cause for concern. This is quite unprecedented. I think Tommaso mentioned it, that's kind of relating to kind of identity politics, which plays a very clear, vibrant role here, and the role of religion. I think in Israel's case, it does kind of, for the most part, meet conventional religious sensibilities, let's say, but it's a very important part of the identity politics which is at play here. I'll say a few words of kind of what we can expect and what's happening now, and then I'm very happy to kind of, I'll signpost issues and then we can talk about them in questions and answers if people are interested. Netanyahu, who was kind of the incumbent prime minister, has a real dilemma. In the past, he's formed a government 5 times before. This is his 6th time. On every occasion until now, he's always preferred to veer to the center. He went with Ehud Barak famously. He went with Lapid himself. He even brought in Tzipi Livni in 2015. Other examples of as well of kind of always preferring to balance himself in the middle of his coalition. On this time round, it appears that he doesn't have that option, and that provides a real problem for him, because in the past, and I think that if we flag up 3 or 4 areas of concern, one is in terms of the religious, the relationship between religion and state, and Israel kind of has this delicate balance of being a Jewish democracy. And then, you know, if you've asked some people, former Supreme Court judges, they said, what's more important, Jewish or democracy? It's the hyphen that is in between them. But that's the balancing act. There is a lot of resentment, especially within the religious parties, about policies that the governments have passed over the last year. And I think, again, it's worth pausing and appreciating just how rare a political project that was that we saw in Israel over the last year, of a huge kind of rainbow coalition of 8 parties coming together, 2 from the center, 2 from the right, 2 from the left, and an Arab party as well. I missed someone out. But the kind of this almost unprecedented, certainly in Israeli politics, perhaps in world politics, to have such a broad range government. And this new government, which is far more homogenous of the religious right, is going to redress some of those balances. So, for example, legislation that was passed last time talking about, I mean, there's some of this sounds quite superficial, but putting an extra tax on disposable plates and cutlery. That was considered, although that was passed because of the environmental agenda, the ultra-Orthodox took offense because they're the ones who are most hard hit and use these products more than everything else. Similar to the reform of restaurants using kosher restaurant certificates, taking away the monopoly from the chief rabbis, changing rules of surrogacy to same-sex couples, the reform of what they refer to as kosher mobile phones, which is the simple phones without internet connections, which again, they did it for economic freedom reasons, but the ultra-Orthodox interpreted this as kind of trying to pollute their youth with giving them access to the internet and disturbing them. So I think all of these things are liable to be reversed and to be changed. One of the most significant issues, and again, it was related to by the previous speaker, is the issue of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary here. This is kind of one of the most keen hot topics that we will be monitoring. To bear in mind, Israel is a very fragile democracy. Unlike other democracies, Israel does not have a written constitution or a written Bill of Rights. It doesn't have a second chamber. It doesn't have a president with any veto capacity. And so that the balance of powers, the significance of the role of an independent judiciary has been incredibly significant. And in fact, Netanyahu himself, the incumbent prime minister, has in the past spoken out passionately in favor of the importance of an international court. An independent court. The international court is certainly something else. So this is kind of where his partners are, partly to alleviate Netanyahu himself from his legal problems, partly because they perceive there is a perception on the Israeli right that, just as I said, Netanyahu always veers to the center, that it's time to let the right govern, and pure democracy means letting the right have their way. And so we're about to see where this intersection takes us, and where they will take it on the legal issue. Another issue certainly of concern for a lot of people here is on the security front. The way that they are presumably dividing up the cabinet portfolios means that they'll be taking some key responsibilities away from the defense minister and giving it to Minister Ben-Gvir, who is charged of this broadened portfolio of national security minister. There's a lot of concern of what that means in terms of rules of engagement, in terms of distinction of authorities over the civil administration, which effectively is the de facto sovereign in the West Bank when it comes to both Jewish settlers and the Palestinians. But one thing I would kind of add, I'll finish with just a few lines of reassurance, if there is something to reassure over. First of all, I think in terms of foreign policy, we're unlikely to see a change. Netanyahu himself was the instigator of the Abraham Accords, which led to a normalization agreement with 3/4 other Arab countries and Muslim countries, and I think that momentum is certainly where he will look to continue that. it's quite clear, although that they are, as a fire sale, giving away key political portfolios, that the Netanyahu will keep for himself in his party the defense and the foreign ministry, which will mean that the Likud will be governing everything in terms of foreign policy. But as it's been said before, that there's no such thing sometimes Israeli foreign policy, and obviously when it comes to the Palestinians, this role will now be split between Ben Gvir and the Minister of Defense. In closing, we've seen a fascinating incident happening just in the last week here over incidents surrounding Hebron. I'm very happy to talk about all of that in more detail if people are interested. But again, I wanted to end on a couple of positive notes, and that's sometimes people use the term deep state with a pejorative meaning. I think in Israel, it actually has a less benign factor, because the deep state in Israel is actually essentially a liberal deep state, and the institutions are strong here, despite the fragility, the independence of the Supreme Court, the leadership of the IDF, a free and vibrant and very critical media here. And one hopes that both those institutional structures and the vibrancy of civil society here will somehow be a break in its own check and balance against the more extreme versions that we could see this new government introduce.
Thank you very much, Richard. We will definitely come back to some of those issues. Over to Yonatan for the final round.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit less reassuring than Richard. I have been following and writing academically and non-academically on the Israeli right for quite a few years now. And I think that looking at Ben Gvir and his rise, his very rapid rise, in isolation would be a mistake, because to understand Israeli politics nowadays, one has to take into account two other factors. The first being a very quick rightward shift in all Israeli parties, including left-wing parties, including the center of Israeli politics, and especially in the Likud party. So speaking about the Likud party as some sort of regular, normal, mainstream right-wing party, I think is a thing of the past. It would have been valid maybe a decade ago, but today one would find a great difficulty in distinguishing between the Likud and its coalitional partners from the so-called far right. I used to open my lectures in conferences and such by playing a little game where I would present the crowd with a few legislative initiatives and quotes from Israeli politicians and European politicians, both from the right, and they would have to tell me which is which. And by doing that, by playing this silly game, one can understand very clearly that it's not only that the far right has risen to power in Israel, it's also that the mainstream right in Israel has shifted very dramatically over the last decade into where the far right used to be. This is manifested in both legislative initiatives, policy-wise, that is, and both in just wild, combative rhetoric against minorities, especially Arabs, but not only, against whoever the right deems a citizen that is not loyal enough. So basically, Netanyahu's opponents, lefties, centrists, and even people on the right are deemed traitors. They're called anti-Israelis, anti-Zionists, anti-Jewish. There's even this new neologism that they invented, calling these people auto-anti-Semites. That is, people who hate themselves as Jews. And this has been a culture war. It's been going on for about a decade now. So Ben Gvir might be the culmination of that, and he's probably the scariest, of them all. But the Likud party in itself has changed radically over the last decade, and I think this is a far more important development in terms of Israeli politics and Israeli society, because the Likud used to give cues to its many avid supporters as to what is legitimate to say in Israeli society, what is not legitimate, drawing the borders in Israeli discourse and Israeli policy. And they are nowadays very, very close to their right-wing partners. In fact, I think there can be something quite deceitful about Netanyahu's extremely impressive personality, intellect, English, presentation skills. Compared to many of his equivalents abroad, who are sometimes ridiculed for their lack of polish, I think Netanyahu stands out as a much more impressive statesman. And that's the reason why in both academic research and popular journalism abroad, it took people observers quite a long time to put him in the same category as people like Bolsonaro, Orban, Trump, etc., etc. But unfortunately, Netanyahu, in his current phase, he wasn't always like that, and he can be a million different things depending on the political circumstances. Unfortunately, in his current phase, I think he definitely belongs in the same category with these people, and only the new government hasn't been formed yet. But the things that have been promised thus far in the agreements between the parties are extremely worrying. Just to name one example, the override clause, which is probably the most menacing of these possible developments, is a legislation that would basically take away from the Supreme Court its ability to enact judicial review of any kind, protect Israeli basic laws, and overrule legislative efforts that in one way or another undermine Israeli basic law. And there are many other different initiatives that would probably weaken the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Huge budgets have been promised to private organizations which are aligned with the far right, anti-LGBT organizations, religious Zionist organizations of different kinds, and they will have a major role in shaping the public school curriculum. This has been also promised as part of Netanyahu's agreements with his new coalitional partners. So that is my second point, that there are very concrete policies that are on the horizon. And third, I think it should be noted that the first groups in Israeli society to be affected by all of this are going to be Israeli Arabs and the Palestinians on the other side of the Green Line. I think this coalition would be hesitant to target liberal Israel, the Israel that is symbolically represented by Tel Aviv and its neighboring cities, because these are people with a lot of clout and money and power and organizational skills. The first to be affected by this is going to be the largest minority in Israel, which are those Arabs that do have a citizenship, and those Arabs on the other side of the Green Line who do not have any citizenship and are under military rule. That is where the Israeli radical right will put its attention and its efforts and its money, and that is where people like Ben Gvir grew up. That is where their spirit was shaped, their rhetoric was acquired, their worldview was developed in Jewish terrorist organizations some of them formally outlawed, in Jewish militias in the territories. This is where these people come from. So it would be the equivalent of appointing in America one of the ringleaders of the January 6th uprising to be in charge of Homeland Security. Okay, Ben-Gvir is going to be in charge of the police, of the Secret Service. He has been indicted dozens of times for being involved in violence and in incitement to violence and racism. A very dangerous person. And so I think it should be, while it certainly, Israel is not turning into a dictatorship, and I don't think no one really seriously argues that. I think, but still, I think we're seeing a new creature, a radicalized Likud party, hand in hand with extremely radical, violent political actors who were legitimized by the cooperation with Likud and who could barely enter the Knesset up until a few years ago. They were so marginal. They, with Likud's help and with Netanyahu's help, because of his own legal entanglements, they have been mainstreamed, and they now are in charge of, are going to be in charge of very important ministries in what is, at the end of the day, we must remember, a very dangerous area, right? In Israel, bad things are always waiting to happen, are always on the horizon. Things have to be taken care of very delicately. And in Netanyahu's favor, it must be said that in the past he knew how to do that. He knew how to balance these different things. I do not think that the next government will be able to do so, just because of its composition and its senior members. So yeah, that is my less reassuring analysis of the situation.
I want to thank the other panelists because they refract some of what I'm going to say about the New Zealand situation, which is a rather different one. It took the Christchurch massacre in 2 mosques and 51 deaths in March 2019 for our government and its security agencies to acknowledge any threat from far-right extremism. This terrorist attack, live streamed globally by the perpetrator, led to the threat level, that's the likelihood of a terrorist attack in New Zealand, rising for the first time from low to medium, that is, from possible to probable. Yesterday, the director of our New Zealand Security Intelligence Services lowered the threat from probable to possible. So there is a kind of cycle. We're at the end of the Christchurch cycle, but I'm going to argue that that may not be actually the case. And my second point is that Tarrant, the Christchurch terrorist, was an Australian visiting New Zealand with the deliberate intention of preparing and undertaking a terrorist act, and partly because of the low levels of terrorist awareness and the then general complacency about security issues in New Zealand. While his attack took place here, its impact was directed globally, or at least to other identitarian Christian white nationalist and supremacist groups. He intended his act to be an accelerationist one that would trigger reprisal attacks and promote a political, religious race war. I just want to mention very quickly far-right groups and the transition that's taken place because of 15/3, because of the event in Christchurch. There were movements before Christchurch, like the Dominion movement based in the capital, which was essentially calling for a white ethno-state, reflecting the majority here. But the campaign of clampdown at the time and immediately after the attack led to them being disbanded. Tarrant's manifesto drew on a number of recognized recognizable extreme right violent tropes, but centrally highlighted replacement theory and necessarily the non-assimilatory nature of Muslim and other migrants. He cited Breivik and Lord's Christendom, and while he refers to himself as a Christian, he's self-critical on these grounds. And the references are more to a Christian past and its power, Christendom, than personal piety. Tarrant didn't make contact with existing groups in New Zealand, although he had extensive links to groups in Austria, Germany, France, Australia, and the US. The group that has arisen and come to prominence after Christchurch and partly out of the Dominion movement is a group known as Action Zealandia, formed in 2019. It's somewhat like an alt-right New Zealand group with its Dominion movement origins, but it's morphed into something else. They have members and are active in Nelson, Wellington, Auckland, and have some activity Palmerston North, Christchurch, and Hamilton. There are a small core of very active members and a much larger group of social media on Gab and Telegraph followers. Action Zealandia consists only of young men. It's a male-only membership. You've got to be wholly of European descent. They're mostly university educated, and their call is for New Zealand to reassert its majority in European cultural identity as this white ethno-state. They subscribe to a version of replacement theory, as in Tarrant's manifesto, and are thus opposed to immigration. And they focus on what they understand to be the alarming changing demographics and birth rates and the current decolonization bicultural project of government and so-called woke New Zealanders. They refer to those as the liberal Marxist order and accuse them of Europhobic hatred of our people. They're opposed to racial mixing, sexual diversities, and spend much of their time leafleting university spaces, including their quite extensive White Lives Matter campaign. They focus on recruitment and engage in expose research, largely focused on Jewish conspiracies. They want to highlight the local Soroshes and Rothschilds, aka Jewish money, that lie, they argue, behind cultural or current multicultural interfaith and historical restitution projects. Action Zealandia espouse environmental cleanup projects, which are often associated with the left, not the right, and physical fitness, especially tramping. They were mobilized by the free speech, hate speech debate that's taken place in New Zealand over 2 years. Officially, they reject violence, but in practice, this isn't evident in their social media postings. One of its members was arrested last year in relation to a terror threat against a mosque. The organization posted a leaked Financial Intelligence Unit document from New Zealand Police on Twitter, and another Action Zealandia member was caught in a sting operation, buying firearms and trying to establish a terror cell, and linked to Atomwaffendivision, a violent American neo-Nazi organization. From mid-2009, reports started to appear about ties between some army personnel and Action Zealandia, although the same individual was active on a number of far-right sites. This activist referenced the Great Replacement and submitted a petition to Parliament to give priority to white South African farmers to come and settle here. He also participated in a rally opposing the United Nations Compact on Migration. He subsequently left the army. Their slogan is building a community for European New Zealanders. As I said, their membership's not open to women, and as they put it, libertarians or drug addicts. They valorize the science and technology that they've understood to develop out of Christian European culture, and many of their posts end with the message, praise God. This Christian call is clearly different from their American inspiration, the American identity movement, and they have links to generation identity in Europe and directly to the alt-right in the United States. Their focus is to normalize far-right politics, and within New Zealand, where there are 2 rather than 6 degrees of separation, they have links to many of the older generation of neo-Nazis, street thugs, and extreme right-wing activists, and so they're closer to them than may be the case in other places. I want to mention one other group very briefly, and then one event, and then I will sum up. I want to mention August Christie, Outlaws of Christ, a far-right identitarian. They describe themselves a martial monastic order or brotherhood of Christian Crusader knights, whose religious purification disciplines include oppression of the flesh. They have links to military personnel at the Lincoln military camp, and members included active and former servicemen. They were looking at their Facebook account, which is now closed. They're prone to anti-Semitic, homophobic, and anti-Islamic materials, and they again subscribe to replacement theory, referring to Chinese and other Asian migrants to New Zealand. One member based in Linton, who was incidentally the co-founder of the Dominion movement as well, was arrested and charged with unauthorized disclosure of information that's likely to prejudice the security of defense of New Zealand. And he was charged with accessing an army computer system for dishonest purposes. August Christie is still active among former servicemen, and the group has significant parallels, I want to suggest, with Oath Keepers in terms of their ideology. The Oath Keepers have similar views on the threat of non-white, particularly Muslim immigration, and this valorization of a Christian military culture. August Christie are also obsessed by covert Jewish satanic power, and that Judaism, in their words, is a diametrical enemy of Christ. Now, there are lots of smaller groups, and there are conscious efforts. We've just had our general elections across the country, where a number of right-wing candidates with links to these movements have been exposed to the voters. The event I want to mention was the occupation of Parliament, which took place for 23 days in parliamentary grounds in February and March this year, with shades of January the 6th and, of course, Ottawa. It brought together a vast constellation, about 3,000 occupiers and much larger numbers of supporters. It was called Convoy NZ 2022, about 80,000 private Facebook members, and included doctors speaking out with science, their anti-vaxxers, the Freedom Alliance, the Outdoors and Freedom Movement, the Freedoms and Rights Coalition, which is a Christian movement, and Action Zealandia. Older fascist links to Steve Bannon's TV platform, links to Alex Jones. Live protest was covered by Counterspin Media, which used that particular platform, anti-Marxist anti-Semitism, and of course supplement sales of Alex Jones's miracle products. The links between this gave a kind of new priority to Action Zealandia, but also strengthened the links with the older fascist groups, which have had somewhat of a revival. They had mock trials, called for a violent overthrow of Parliament, and it's an event that ended rather badly with the police dismantling the occupation, eviction, and quite a lot of physical violence. Now, my summary of this is, what does this all amount to? I went last week to the government's counter-terrorism, countering violent extremism conference, the emphasis is on a very theoretical emphasis on decolonizing security within the Treaty of Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi framework with Indigenous peoples. And there's growing anxiety about transnational community violence such as a Punjabi hitman being sent to, he failed and attempted murder a Sikh leader in Auckland, and so transnational developments are impacting here. Now, what does it all amount to? There's certainly a transition that others have alluded to between skinhead and collective mob violence with its 1930s associations to a rather different, better educated and at least a more cogent ideological formation. No better, but at least its presentation is more cogent. We're in the highlight here is that it's begun entering mainstream politics. We have an election in 23, and high on the agenda are issues of racial privilege for Indigenous people versus the other side's dismantling of white privilege. The Action Zealandia leader, James Fairbairn, who is an army reservist and has been arrested, as I said, on many charges. There are other members engaged in actual violence, and there is a kind of promise of violence for this coming general election year. The research undertaken at Auckland over the last 24 months shows a massive spike during the occupation of the rhetoric on social media platforms and sites of violent rhetoric. And but what it all amounts to, I was hoping to participate today and learn from you and about other far-right movements around the place. New Zealand's still anxious because even though we've raised our awareness, we've lowered our threat level, and we were entirely blindsided by 3 years ago by Tarrant, and these issues are becoming ever more vocalized and tending towards the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anyone has questions, they can put their hand up and I will go to them, or if they put them in the chat, I will ask them. If I go to the first question, I just want to, in terms of the far right as it is at the moment, is it a legal challenge that we lack? Do we need more legal tools for security services? Is it more a social issue? What would be your kind of immediate go-to list of reforms that we would make to try and bring this problem under control? If I go to Colin first.
Well, I'll speak from a U.S. perspective, and I've been pretty vocal, along with folks like Jason Blazakis, Bruce Hoffman, and others about the need for a domestic terrorism statute. We're lacking that here in the United States, and we tend to work pretty closely with the FBI and federal law enforcement. Those folks that are on the front lines say they need more tools, more resources. Now, there's a clear slippery slope argument here, and I think it's a valid one. I mean, there's major concern, particularly with the way the partisan nature of U.S. politics at the moment, that politicians could use a domestic terrorism statute against political enemies. In fact, former President Trump came out and said he would. He said he would designate Antifa and Black Lives Matter, even though if you ask any counterterrorism expert in the United States, they would say that those groups don't warrant designation. Particularly, they wouldn't be within the top 5 based in terms of the threat. So the long answer is yes, we do need it. I don't see us getting to that place anytime soon, particularly given the kind of partisan gridlock that we look at on a regular basis here in Congress. We haven't even had hearings on Capitol Hill to discuss the issue in a transparent way.
Thank you, Colin. Tommaso. I think you're on mute.
Sorry?
No, you're here.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand well your question, you are pointing to possible solutions, right?
Yes, kind of what you would, if you were put in charge of the situation, what changes you would try to make to bring it, to reduce the size of the problem?
So there are certain solutions that are clearly judicial. If you see what happened with Golden Dawn in Greece, which was clearly and evidently neo-Nazi party that has been dismantled and its leaders are currently serving prison terms. Because in that case, I mean, the solution is quite evident. If, as per my premise, as per my speech, if you are clearly going against the liberal democratic order, you are outside the perimeter of the legality. In other cases, the situation is more nuanced. Another concrete example, what's happening in Germany now with AfD. There is a section within AfD which is under surveillance by security services because it's considered a potential threat that could escalate. But at the same time, the discussion on whether to dismantle the party or not is not going anywhere. Actually, I was reading a few days ago an interview with the head of the liberal, the FDP party in the parliament that was against this ban. When the ban is not advisable, and it should be, I agree with Colin, I mean, the ban is a serious measure and it should be based on, the liberal democratic society should be based on very clear benchmarks. When this is not possible, there are different ways of countering the extreme right. One way is where the left, the Nordic left, I would say, in Denmark and Sweden is going towards. I mean, they are completely reassessing their own narrative in order to address certain grievances and certain problems in their society, which for a long time have been left to the right. Other solutions are, they kind of related to the European Union, I would say. When these parties go in power, they need to come to terms with the rules of the European Union if they want the money of the European Union, especially. And all of these countries, Italy, Hungary, Poland, but everywhere in the European Union were very much dependent on the EU, both in legal terms, but what mattered most from the perspective of politicians is money. So these parties tend to readjust themselves automatically, both because of the European Union and because of the market. You will not hear anymore Giorgia Meloni speaking of leaving Euro as she used to do when she founded the party. So there are external constraints somehow that force these parties to moderate.
Thank you. Over to Richard.
Thank you. Well, I think the situation in Israel is quite different and significant. And as I've tried to put a more positive spin, but I do agree broadly with Yonatan's assessment as well, that we're entering to an extent uncharted territory where the cats are guarding the cream, and the issue of the override law of negating judicial review is the classic example of which we'll see exactly how that plays out. Again, with the most positive thing I can say is that the devil will be in the details. That there is you can pass an override law, which is a blanket override law, which includes everything, every piece of legislation, and neuters the High Court completely, or it can be specific, relating to only certain aspects of judicial review. It can also depend on whether it counts as a special majority, both within the Knesset, the Parliament, or a special majority amongst the Supreme Court to raise the threshold of being able to overturn. And what we've heard initially from the coalition negotiations we're in now is that such wide-ranging legislation will take probably up to a year, maybe even more, to fully develop and to come into a package. And there are other issues relating to the selection of Supreme Court judges, of the role of the Attorney General, and splitting that role into two different roles. And so all of this is coming together in part of this judicial reform, and we'll have to wait and see exactly how that develops. A second point would be kind of, again, relating to the traditional gatekeepers when it comes to rules of engagement, and in terms of the military, the IDF have a great leeway of independence and be able to focus their own policy. And that's kind of the discourse that we're seeing being played out in public this week, after the incident in Hebron over the weekend, where a soldier kind of made very blatant and harsh political statements in favor of the radical Ben Gvir and kind of what he's going to be doing when he takes power. And that's not something that the army can accept. Israel has an army of conscripts, kind of everyone's sons and daughters kind of theoretically all serve, and it cannot be that the politicians are able to interfere and to get involved into those rules of engagement. On the other side, the politicians will say that it's actually entirely appropriate. The politicians are there to set the boundaries, to set the framework, and it's then for the army to carry it out. So this is kind of the zeitgeist of the discourse which is going on here. It's a cultural clash between those two views, and again, we'll have to just see how that plays out.
Thank you very much. Over to Yonatan.
Yeah, if we're talking about Jewish extremism, then I think it's the solutions are complex and multi-layered, but let me focus on just two of them. The first one should be a political solution. The rightward tilt of Israeli politics and the transformation of Israel's right-wing parties into far-right parties can only be countered by the establishment of a reinvigorated center-left camp, which is now fragmented, exhausted, and weaker than ever. So I think in order to counter these trends, you first need a deep change happening within the political system. You need counter rhetoric, you need counter ideas, you need this counter hegemony to the ideas that the far right has been spreading over the last decade, taking advantage of people's mostly security anxieties. So first of all, a lot of work has to be done in politics, because right now, what has been happening over the last decade is that centrist parties have been changing policies and rhetoric in accordance with wherever the right was going. Due to delegitimization campaigns and this ongoing assault on their legitimacy, they were trying to pretend to be right-wing, and as a result, took the center ground of Israeli politics more and more to the right. I think now, over the last year or so, Lapid and other leaders of that camp realize that this is not only electorally devastating, but also morally wrong. And they're now trying to insist more on these core values of liberal democracy, and let's see if that works. In terms of actually countering Jewish extremism, it's just a matter of political will, and the political will hasn't been there. Everyone, especially the Secret Service, and every counter-terrorism analyst in Israel knows very, very well where these pockets of Jewish extremism, Jewish supremacy, and violence, where the breeding ground is. From mainstream settlements to the many illegal outposts scattered around the West Bank, where they are protected by the government, they are funded by the government, where they have their own independent education schools and educational institutions, where the government pays for teachers, but has absolutely no say in the curriculum, and the radical things taught there are very quickly translated into anti-Palestinian violence, sometimes also anti-lefty violence, depends on on the incident, but this is only a matter of political will. You don't have to look very clear. You don't. It's everyone knows where these extremists are, where they are being taught, whatever they're being taught, and no government so far has been strong enough or sure of itself enough to evacuate these illegal outposts which defy its own laws. It's an ironic situation. It's a strange situation, hard to explain to foreigners, but these places that are defined by the government itself as illegal are breeding ground for everyday harassment and violence against our own soldiers as well. But they are being left there because the settler movement has such strong political power within Israeli politics. And nowadays it has a seat on the around the most sacred of tables, the cabinet table. So I don't see any of this happening anytime soon.
Thank you. And if we go to Paul for the last answer to this.
A very quick comment. What seems to have been quite effective was the banning of automatic weapons after Christchurch, and that was opposed and seemed very dramatic. But I mean, it physically stops. We've had one terrorist attack since then with a knife, and stabbing 6 people and killing no one is very different from mowing down 51 people. So that seems to make a difference, although apparently there's an increase in illegal guns. There are 2 other changes that have taken place. One, and both are worrying. There have been increased powers given to our security services to search and seizure without warrants in extreme cases, which raise issues about human rights and about the misuse of such surveillance, particularly, and seizure. And we've had one case recently about a left-wing journalist who's now being compensated by the courts for what was a politically motivated use of the security intelligence services. So these are worrying developments. The last thing is, going through Parliament at the moment with no certainty of being passed, is an extension to our hate speech legislations to include in the incitement to violence category religious hate, which is a direct legacy of 2019. I don't think we have many political solutions, but there are a number of legal responses that some have proved more effective than others, but are still the favored way for pursuing improvements in this area. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat, which is about the relationship between the Israeli far right and the Western far right. And I guess to what Tommaso was saying earlier about the difference between the traditional and the new right. A lot of these European parties would have been anti-Semitic in the past, excuse me, and a lot of them are now, ostensibly anyway, pro-Israel, even as they continue engaging in anti-Semitic tropes. So to take that on as a question, over to Colin for the first round.
Yeah, just the honest answer is I don't know what the connections are between the Israeli far right and groups in the West. You know, in the US, a lot of these neo-Nazi groups, the Atomoffens, the base of the world, are highly, highly anti-Semitic. They also, just in gleaning their chats, you know, and this is not to underestimate these groups, including their proclivity for violence, but from a geopolitical standpoint, they're not very nuanced. They don't really understand a lot of the kind of complex dynamics. They go for the low-hanging fruit, which is the anti-Semitic stuff. So I think that's something to be aware of, as well as kind of, you know, this obsession with Russia. We see that bleeding over into even our own politics and aspects of Congress. But, you know, if you want to look at somebody that, you know, has engaged in kind of, or flirted with, or been adjacent to anti-Semitism while still claiming to love Israel, look no farther than Donald Trump. Apparently you can thread that needle. He's done it. He continues to do it. and he's still running for president of this country despite exhortations to political violence in his role on January 6th, and then still continuing to meet with the Nick Fuentes of the world under the guise of, well, I didn't know who that was. If you still believe, I've got a bridge to sell you.
I think I would stick to what I said, meaning that I don't think these extremism followers in Europe are that prominent. I think they are quite marginal. If we mean with those, the ones that really stick to the neo-Nazi rhetoric, which is viciously anti-Semitic. I mean, those who come to my mind are Forza Nuova in Italy, the old Haider, when he was the head of the Freedom Party in Austria, that even received money from Saddam Hussein, the Jobbik of 2013 that was proposing to like create a register of Jews in the country. But these, I think, are very marginal now. So Israeli parties actually now have more friends than foes in what is called the far right, or the right which is in power at the moment. I think Israeli parties have much more troubles with leftist parties in Europe. If you think about Corbyn, Mélenchon, the classical socialist movements, because the new right, as I was saying, is making a mark of its own identity, whether for genuine reasons or to stress its anti-Muslim agenda, to be strongly pro-Israel. So in this sense, I don't see the Israeli parties having so much of the trouble with those parties whose constituency I don't think is anti-Israel or anti-Semitic.
Thank you. Over to Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, I would tend to agree with both previous speakers. I don't think there is a direct, political cooperation between the Jewish hard right and the Europeans. I mean, essentially, they were talking of different religions, and it's quite obvious that the Jewish far right still see the Christian far right or a European far right in the shades of the enemy. Although I would agree with Tommaso as well that kind of more and more the threat is more kind of perceived from the hard left and the challenges there. What I do think there is perhaps some commonality and similarity is in the tactical approach. I think certainly the use of social media, kind of the radicalization online, both in terms of as a recruiter and also in terms of kind of the seeing harsh rhetoric and very problematic language. That's something that I think is really right. I probably learned from the from other right groups. And similarly as a campaigning as well, the whole notion of popularism and being able to tap into that was again something that was seen as very cleverly exploited by the right in this last election, particularly, and maybe appealing to low socioeconomic, low levels of educated people, that kind of where jingoistic statements are able to captivate the audience and galvanize them further. So I think there is a tactical combination, but no direct cooperation.
Thank you very much. Yonatan.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question because the tension exists. It doesn't exist because when it comes to cooperation with fringe neo-Nazi groups, because obviously these ties just simply are not there. But it does exist when right-wing parties in Israel cooperate closely and maintain close relationships with populist parties in Europe. Just to give you one example, I have quite a few, but one example would be Viktor Orban in Hungary, where his anti-Soros campaign was all about dog whistling, anti-Semitic tropes and dog whistles. And at one point, the Jewish community, leadership of the Jewish community in Hungary, asked Netanyahu to actually criticize Orban, or cut ties, do some sort of action on the international stage in order to condemn what they saw as an attack on their communities. Netanyahu refused because he's closely allied with himself with Orban, and in a way sees him, just like Trumpists look at Orban in many ways, as a model, as somewhat of an inspiration. In fact, Orban was the first leader to call Netanyahu and congratulate him after the last elections. So this is just one example of where, when we see this tension between anti-Semitic tropes on the one hand and the close cooperation of Netanyahu and his allies with their equivalents abroad. Now, the common ground that they often find is anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment, and in that way, they can then go to, when these arguments are heard in Israel, they can go to the public and say, oh, they're not really anti-Semitic because Israelis will not even pick up on these dog whistles, and then present their anti-Arab or so-called pro-Israeli rhetoric as proof of their, not being real anti-Semites. So they, tread this thin ice of cooperating with these people whilst denying their anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Thank you very much. And if we go to Paul for the last answer.
I just had another thought about the earlier point about legislative change. In the public discourse we had about electoral reform, Israel was cited as a really good reason why we should not adjust the 5% threshold for the smaller parties, and so lowering that or raising it from 3 to 5, given the figures in our last election, makes a quite radical difference. So that's a thought. But on that, it's a really fascinating issue about the positioning of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's certainly the case that in our last election, the Destiny Party, the Christian National Party, are pro-Israel on Christian Zionist principles, whereas two of the other extreme right parties with more conspiracy theories are deeply anti-Semitic. And so there are clearly lines that need to be carefully disentangled there. On there's one particular group here where, of course, anti-Semitism is quite compatible with pro-Zionism and blurs it again. But the caveat being that they advocate that New Zealand's Jews leave and go to Israel, who they admire, given what our two speakers from Israel have been saying. They admire it for the way in which they've managed their own ethno-state. So this obviously is something that needs to be quite carefully disentangled, and a new set of connections thought through and established. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have run on longer than we planned. Thank you all for being here. It was a great panel. I'm sure things like electoral reform we may pick up next time. We definitely hope to have you all back at some point in the future. See you soon.